What's going on? YouTube, listen up, young elder gang. This is Chief Whitebird at you with another banger. Please make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video, fam. I hope this video get at least 100,000 likes in this video. You will find history definitions, scripture information, and best of all, what we Americans have been deprived of from the beginning. The truth, keep in mind, this content used in this video is intended for entertainment, educational, and informational purposes only. We will give you the total truth as we best understand it today. Be sure to hit that like button, young elder gang, hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel, hit that bell, and don't forget to check back with us every day for new content. Why colonizers told Native Americans they came from Africa on a slave ship. Imagine a world unmapped by European hands, a continent alive with nations, languages, and stories stretching back into time. Before the arrival of outsiders, this land was a tapestry of civilizations, each with its own traditions, wisdom, and ways of living in harmony with the earth. The rivers, mountains, and forests were not just resources, but sacred relatives, woven into the daily lives and spiritual beliefs of the people who called this place home. This was a land where people's identities were woven into the very soil beneath their feet. Every footprint told a story, every stone and tree held meaning, and the connection between people and place was unbreakable, passed down through generations in song, ceremony, and memory. But across the Atlantic, a shadow was growing. Ships with tall masts, men with unfamiliar beliefs, and a hunger for dominion. These were not mere travelers, but agents of empires, driven by dreams of conquest and riches, their ambitions casting a long, ominous shadow over the horizon. This was not a meeting of equals, but the dawn of a tragic transformation. The first encounters were fraught with tension, misunderstanding, and fear, as two worlds collided with consequences neither could fully foresee. The arrival of these strangers was not discovery, it was invasion. For those already here, it marked the beginning of a relentless struggle for survival, as foreign flags were planted in ancient soil. They brought steel, gunpowder, and a powerful weapon, the story. Their weapons could wound the body, but their words and beliefs would strike at the heart of identity, reshaping reality itself. A story crafted to justify the unimaginable, to sever the sacred bond between people and their heritage. Through ink and parchment, they rewrote the past, erasing voices and memories that had endured for centuries. The first step in conquest is not battle, but convincing a people, and the world, that they were never who they thought they were. By undermining identity, colonizers sought to break the spirit before breaking the body. Colonizers saw vibrant cultures as obstacles, and to take the land, they first had to take the identity. Ceremonies were outlawed, languages forbidden, and traditions dismissed as primitive or dangerous. They dismantled history piece by piece until only a hollowed-out caricature remained. What was once a living culture became a shadow, distorted and misunderstood by those who claimed to know better. The darkness was not just violence and disease, but a deliberate erasure of truth. Stories, songs, and knowledge were targeted, as if by erasing memory. The conquerors could erase resistance itself. The conflict would rage for centuries, fought in courtrooms, classrooms, and mines. Laws and lessons became new battlegrounds as the struggle for identity and justice continued through generations. If you control a people's story, you control their destiny. The power to define the past shapes the future, and the fight for truth becomes a fight for survival. The epic story of the Americas was about to be violently rewritten, with blood and tears as ink. The struggle for memory, identity, and justice would echo through the centuries, shaping the very soul of a continent. The colonizers' first move was to sever the deepest root, the origin story. They understood that to truly conquer a people, you must first unravel their sense of belonging, their connection to the land, and the stories that bind them to it. Native Americans knew they belonged to this land, their creation stories affirming a sacred connection. For countless generations, their ancestors had walked these forests, fished these rivers, and honored the spirits of the earth. Their identity was woven into every mountain, every stream, every sunrise. But to the colonizer, this truth was inconvenient. A people born of the land have an inherent right to it. But the Pope said under the Doctrine of Discovery, if they're not Christians. We could enslave them, take their land, and burn their villages to the ground. Such a claim as birthrights to the land threatened the colonial project, making dispossession not just difficult, but morally indefensible. On August 10, 1846, the Moorish Zionist guys founded the Smithsonian Institution, or simply the Smithsonian, is a group of museums, education, and research centers created by the U.S. government for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. It operates as a trust instrumentality and is not formally a part of any of the three branches of the federal government. The institution is named after its founding donor, British scientist James Smithson. It was originally organized as the United States National Museum, but that name ceased to exist administratively in 1967. The Smithsonian Institution played a key role in changing and creating the Native Americans came from Africa on slave ship narrative. They hid and covered up thousands of artifacts that proved the Native Americans were dark-skinned people and ranged from dark skin to the color of a penny Mississippi clay dirt. You remember the brown paper bag test, right? So, a new story was invented, one that rewrote the past. Native Americans, they claimed, were not truly indigenous, but descendants of Africans brought on slave ships. This narrative was designed to undermine their legitimacy and sever their ancient ties. This fabrication was carefully constructed and spread through sermons, journals, and official documents. Colonial leaders, preachers, and writers all played their part, weaving the lie into the fabric of daily life. Shared features were twisted into proof, as if appearance alone could erase centuries of heritage. Pseudoscience and prejudice worked hand in hand, distorting reality to fit the colonial agenda. And the vast diversity among indigenous nations was ignored. Hundreds of unique cultures, languages, and histories were flattened into a single false narrative. The narrative seeped into consciousness, creating confusion where clarity once stood. Over time, even some began to question their own origins as the fog of misinformation spread. It was preached from pulpits, written into records, and repeated by politicians. The lie gained authority with every retelling, embedding itself in law and custom. The story was simple, easy to repeat, and served a powerful purpose: to transform a people with millennia of history into recent arrivals, strangers in their own homeland. By claiming Native Americans came from Africa, colonizers erased thousands of years, aligning their story with the slave trade. This allowed them to justify land theft as a natural progression of history, rather than an act of violence. The goal: create a historical vacuum, a blank slate for colonial entitlement. With the past erased, the future could be rewritten to suit colonial ambitions. This was not rumor, but a strategic weapon of information warfare. The manipulation of history became a tool as powerful as any musket or sword. The birth of this lie marked the start of stealing not just land but memory itself. It was an assault on identity, a theft of the stories that make a people whole, and a wound that echoes through generations. Here's why it was impossible to transport millions of slaves from Africa to the Americas within the given time frame, 1600 to 1800. It was better just to enslave the natives. Slave ships, even purpose-built ones, had finite carrying capacity. While some vessels could carry several hundred enslaved individuals, transporting millions simultaneously or within a relatively short period was logistically unfeasible due to space constraints. The transatlantic voyage itself, known as the Middle Passage, took weeks or even months depending on the route and weather conditions. This limited the frequency of voyages and the total number of people who could be transported in a given period. Each ship required a crew to operate, and transporting millions would necessitate a massive increase in maritime personnel, which was beyond the capacity of European nations at the time. The cramped, unsanitary, and brutal conditions on slave ships led to staggeringly high mortality rates due to disease, dysentery, smallpox, etc., violence, and despair. Estimates indicate that between 10% and 30% of enslaved people died during the Middle Passage, and this could be even higher on some voyages. Such mortality rates would significantly limit the number of individuals who could successfully reach the Americas. Building, equipping, and operating the immense fleet of ships needed to transport millions of people would have required an unprecedented level of capital investment that European powers of the time couldn't readily achieve. The infrastructure needed to capture, transport, and sell millions of individuals across Africa and the Americas would have strained the existing trading networks. True African societies engaged in resistance, including revolts on slave ships, which impacted the volume and efficiency of the slave trade. African resistance made it impossible to transport millions of slaves between 1600 to 1800. Also, Ships in the 1600s to 1800s had limited capacity to store fresh water, especially for long voyages like the Middle Passage. Carrying large numbers of enslaved people would have required an immense amount of fresh water for drinking, sanitation, and even some cooking needs. Replenishing fresh water supplies during the journey was challenging. Ships relied on rainwater or coastal sources, which were unpredictable. Drinking salt water exacerbates dehydration, potentially leading to severe health complications and even death. Salt water itself doesn't directly cause disease like scurvy, but inadequate fresh water contributes to poor hygiene and makes people more susceptible to illnesses, which spread rapidly in crowded conditions on slave ships. While some rudimentary methods of desalination existed, they were not efficient enough for large-scale freshwater production needed for voyages transporting thousands of people. Even if the technology had been more advanced, the costs and infrastructure needed to implement it on slave ships would have been prohibitive. In summary, we did the numbers on the slave narrative, and they don't add up. Why colonizers told Native Americans they came from Africa on a slave ship, to dehumanize and justify enslavement. By falsely associating Native Americans as African slaves, colonizers could attempt to strip them of their inherent worth and identity, making it easier to justify their enslavement and mistreatment. This fits with the broader colonial discourse of portraying indigenous populations as inferior or savage. Another reason was to undermine Native American claims to the land. By claiming Native Americans were not the original inhabitants of the land, but rather newcomers from a different continent who arrived as slaves, colonizers could attempt to delegitimize their connection to the land and justify their own claims to it. Another reason was to instill fear and control. Spreading fear and disrupting tribal structures was a common tactic used by colonizers. A narrative of forced migration and slavery could instill fear and make Native Americans less likely to resist colonial rule. Another reason was to create divisions and weaken resistance. By attempting to link Native Americans with the African slave population, colonizers might have hoped to create divisions and animosity between these groups, preventing them from forming alliances against the colonizers. Another reason was to further a settler colonial agenda. Settler colonialism requires the erasure or subjugation of indigenous populations to establish permanent control over their land. Creating false origin stories and narratives of inferiority served this purpose. Colonization involved a range of deceptive practices and strategies, including manipulating treaties, portraying indigenous peoples as inferior, and using violence to seize land and resources. The historical record indicates that both Native Americans and Africans were subjected to enslavement by European colonizers. Native Americans actively resisted colonization in various ways, including forming alliances, adapting to changing circumstances, and maintaining their cultural traditions. Exploring the potential motivations behind such a narrative illuminates the broader strategies of dehumanization, land theft, and control that were central to the colonizers' project. Based on historical facts, some colonizers and later the U.S. government sought to reclassify Native Americans to serve their own interests, particularly regarding treaties and land claims and land grabs. Here's why they reclassified them under the terms like black, Negro, and colored. Dispossession and erasure of identity. By reclassifying Native Americans as black or colored, colonizers could undermine their claim to the land and resources promised in treaties, arguing they were not Indian anymore. This was a tactic used to force Native Americans to forget their heritage and prevent them from claiming treaty benefits. Justification for racialized slavery. In most cases, the lines between free Native Americans and enslaved Native Americans through prisoners of war blurred. Virginia, for example, passed a law in 1670 defining slavery of the natives as a lifelong inherited racial status, which resulted in most Native American being classified as black Africans and forced into slavery. This allowed for the expansion of chattel slavery of Native Americans, where the enslaved person was considered Christian property. The categorization of Native Americans into racial categories like Negro or colored served as a means of control and assimilation into the dominant white society. This was part of a larger system of cultural genocide aimed at erasing Native American identities and forcing conformity to free white people European society. In the early colonizing period, Native Americans were sold into slavery, though this practice proved problematic for the colonizers. Classifying Native Americans as Negro or colored facilitated their sale and exchange in the slave trade, as these terms were associated with enslaved status. These classifications were also rooted in existing prejudices and the desire to create a rigid social hierarchy with free white Europeans at the top. Terms like Negro and colored carried negative connotations and served to dehumanize and marginalize Native Americans. The term Negro itself may have originally been used by Europeans to describe indigenous populations, indicating a pre-existing bias based on skin color. The reclassification of Native Americans as black, Negro, or colored was a multifaceted strategy employed by colonizers to achieve various goals, including the theft of land, enforcement of racialized slavery, suppression of Native American identity, and maintenance of social hierarchy. Colonizers enslaved Native Americans for several reasons, primarily driven by economic, social, and ideological factors. Colonization aimed to extract resources and establish profitable enterprises like mining and plantations. A large, cheap labor force was needed to achieve this, and Native Americans were readily available. Enslaving Native Americans offered a path to wealth and economic growth for the colonizers through their forced labor and the potential sale of captives. Enslavement asserted control and authority over indigenous populations, establishing a clear hierarchy with colonists at the top. Enslavement served as a means to remove Native Americans from their land, clearing the way for colonization, expansion, and land left for the taking. Enslavement of Native Americans, particularly in the context of warfare, was used to subdue resistance and prevent further conflict, sometimes by selling captives to other colonies or sending them overseas. Colonizers often held prejudiced views of Native Americans, viewing them as inferior and justifying their enslavement as a natural consequence of their perceived inferiority. The idea of converting Native Americans to Christianity by force was often intertwined with forced labor, where colonizers viewed it as a way to civilize and save them while simultaneously benefiting from their labor. European colonization transformed these practices, leading to a much more extensive and brutal system of enslavement of Native American for economic gain. The devastating impact of European diseases on Native American populations led to a decline in their numbers, which, combined with other factors like rebellions, understanding these multifaceted reasons helps explain the historical context and complexities of Native American enslavement during the colonial era. Native American slavery declined rapidly due to several interconnected factors: the high rate of escape by enslaved Native Americans, their susceptibility to European diseases. Native Americans' familiarity with the land and ability to evade capture, they needed another plan. There were too many natives to enslave them all. Native Americans, having a deep understanding of the local terrain, found it easier to escape their enslavers and blend back into their communities or seek refuge with other tribes. This was happening a lot. They called these Native Americans runaways, which later became known as the Seminole. They lie and say they were slaves, but were prisoners of war with the USA Corporation. European diseases like smallpox and measles had a devastating effect on Native American populations, leading to significant mortality and hindering their ability to be used as a labor source. Some argue that the strength of certain Native American nations in comparison to the European colonies made it more difficult to enslave them in large numbers, so they had to reclassify them. It was to many Native Americans to destroy them completely like they wanted to do. They said, "We will conquer them by reclassifying them as blacks, Negroes, and colored. That will teach them a lesson. We will misdirect them. Then tell them they came from Africa as slaves on a slave ship. It was a masterpiece to steal their land and estate. We will wipe their memory of their mothers and forefathers who are indigenous to this land, Turtle Island. Don't forget about the George Washington challenge. He knew some of the natives were Moors." With the lie of African origin seeded, it became a tool for dehumanization. By linking Native Americans to Africans, colonizers extended the logic of enslavement. If they were from Africa, their bondage was just an extension of an existing system. This narrative provided moral and pseudoscientific justification for bondage, allowing colonizers to sidestep the truth of enslaving the land's original inhabitants. It stripped Native individuals of their unique identities, reducing them to a single, racialized category. Their humanity was denied, their history erased, and their bodies commodified. The lie was the key to mass exploitation, turning people into property. The chains were not only physical, but mental, psychological torture designed to break the will to resist. By attacking identity at its core, colonizers aimed to create a population easier to control. The false origin story was a direct assault on Native American land claims. It wasn't just a simple misunderstanding or a minor detail in the history books. It was a calculated narrative, designed to undermine the very foundation of Indigenous rights to their ancestral territories. A people's claim to land is deeply rooted in their history, ancestry, and sacred sites. These places are not just physical locations, but living connections to ancestors, traditions, and spiritual beliefs that have been passed down for countless generations. By fabricating the idea that Native Americans were recent arrivals from Africa, colonizers argued that their connection to the land was no more valid than their own. This falsehood erased centuries of Indigenous presence, culture, and stewardship, painting them as outsiders on their own land. The narrative reframed colonization as a competition between immigrants, justifying land theft. It allowed colonizers to claim moral and legal authority, as if both groups were newcomers with equal claim, rather than invaders displacing original inhabitants. The lie severed the sacred bond between Native peoples and their territories, turning millennia of relationship into a recent settlement. This distortion made it easier to dismiss Indigenous rights and ignore the deep spiritual and cultural ties to the land. It justified policies like the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears, leading to forced removals, suffering, and loss that still echo through generations. Land was not just a resource, it was identity, law, and ceremony. Every river, mountain, and valley held stories, laws, and meaning, woven into the fabric of daily life and governance. The false story shook these foundations, making dispossession seem legitimate. It provided a convenient excuse for erasing Indigenous presence, as if history could be rewritten with a single lie. Treaties were ignored, nations removed, and ancestral grounds lost. The promises made to Native peoples were broken, their sovereignty dismissed, and their homes taken away. The erasure of land and identity became a vicious cycle of dispossession. As land was lost, so too were languages, traditions, and the very sense of belonging, leaving scars that endure to this day. The false origin story was also a tool of divide and conquer. Colonizers knew solidarity between Native Americans and the Africans threatened their power. The lie blurred lines between oppressions, creating mistrust and animosity. It forced both groups into identity debates, making alliances difficult and keeping them isolated. The colonial regime encouraged competition for recognition and resources, fostering resentment. This manipulation ensured energy was spent on internal conflict, not unified resistance. By tangling the roots of both communities, colonizers strengthened their own control. The lie about Native origins became law, paper genocide through bureaucracy. Officials used censuses and certificates to reclassify Native Americans as colored or black, erasing legal identity. This policy dissolved Native status and rights with the stroke of a pen. Once reclassified, individuals lost treaty rights, resources, and legal standing. The paper genocide was a quiet, ruthless form of ethnic cleansing. Virginia's Racial Integrity Act enforced the one-drop rule, erasing tribes from records. Bureaucrats like Walter Plecker systematically changed documents, making federal recognition nearly impossible. The goal: shrink the Native population on paper until tribes disappeared. This freed up land and resources for the taking. Bureaucratic warfare finished what violence and disease had started. The colonial project was built on legal theories like the Doctrine of Discovery. Papal edicts gave Christian explorers the right to claim lands and sovereignty over non-Christians. This doctrine became the foundation of U.S. law, stripping Native Americans of land ownership. Supreme Court cases and acts like Indian removal and Dawes justified dispossession. False narratives provided social justification. The law provided the mechanism. Stories dehumanized, laws dispossessed. A two-pronged attack, propaganda and policy, created a self-reinforcing system of oppression. These strategies are part of a universal blueprint for dehumanization and control. To control a people, you must redefine them, strip their history, dignity, and humanity. The pattern is familiar. The Holocaust began with stories, not gas chambers. Nazis crafted false narratives, spread propaganda, and codified dehumanization into law. The Rwandan genocide followed the same steps: false origin stories, relentless propaganda, legal exclusion, and then violence. Whether in the Americas, Europe, or Africa, the method is consistent. Invent a false history, dehumanize, codify into law, then justify dispossession or extermination. These tragedies are never spontaneous. They are deliberate, calculated choices. Understanding this blueprint is crucial to preventing future atrocities. The first weapon is always the story. The colonial lies did not vanish. They cast long shadows today. Paper genocide created challenges for tribes seeking recognition, forcing them to prove erased identities. Historical trauma fuels ongoing poverty, health issues, and social distress. False narratives persist, fueling stereotypes and invisibility. When native nations fight for land and water, they face the same old arguments, descendants of colonial lies. Understanding this history is an act of resistance and restoration. To challenge the lies is to restore truth and honor Indigenous histories. Remembering is essential for healing and justice. The truth survives in oral traditions, languages, and resilience. By confronting the past, we can build a future where every story matters.